Tēnā koutou, ko Cain Kerehoma taku ingoa, ko taku māma no ngā pai maunga o Tararua, ara ko Ngāti Raukawa, ko Ngāti Toa, ko Maupoko, taku pāpā no Ngāti Pro, no reira, tēnei rā te mihi atu kia koutou. I started in 2008 as a consultant with Kāhui Tautoko when they were in the little house on Pipitea Street down in Wellington, and I did about 4.5-5 years with the New Zealand based team at Kāhui Tautoko, and then me and my whānau went over to Vancouver, over to Canada, and joined the team over there for another 4.5 years, and then we returned to Te Tai Rāwhiti, returned home back to Aotearoa at the end of 2016. So yeah, we've been home about 9 years now. And yeah, absolutely loved our time at Kāhui Tautoko, and those connections have been maintained and strengthened even since we've returned home. Yeah, two projects that come to mind probably in Aotearoa. I was working on the whānau water policy at the time, and we were, I guess one of the big advantages of working for Kāhui Tautoko was we were able to move at both a high level sort of policy space, and we were doing a lot of the work in the background with Te Puni Kōkiri and those architecting a lot of the policy pieces, but also got to work directly in communities. And the one that I really enjoyed working with was the whānau in Wairoa, as we were setting up the whānau water collective there. And just going through the process of reimagining the space for strengthening and engaging and supporting whānau. Really, it was a real privilege to kind of sit at the table and be holding space for those discussions, and just picking up on a lot of the wisdom, a lot of the experience of those sort of sitting at the tables as they were, coming up with big and bold kind of new ideas. It was a real adventure, at that sort of space, and it's been cool to see some of how some of that work has flowed on. Over in Canada, I think some of the closest work that I did was with the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam people. They were pretty much our adopted families while we were away from home. We were working in those communities just about every day, and getting to know the people, and yeah, a lot of just that reciprocity of learning, of being able to take what we've learned sort of from home, but also equally pick up some some real depth of learning over there in terms of particularly around some of the cultural kind of frameworks, how their approach to well-being, to health, to whānau, to to all of those pieces as well. So those are definitely sort of some of the key highlights of my time. For the whānau water, sort of space, what's been cool to see is having come back home, after being away, is just the flow of work and just the journey that's been taken down, in Wairoa with different things kind of emerging. Some wins, some losses, while, it's a learning process. And so I think, but just seeing whānau in a new light, not as sort of a space to go and fix people, but to, how do we really create spaces of empowerment for whānau through lots of different avenues. And so, I think I probably get down there at least once a year or a couple of times a year, and just still see the ones that were around at that time, and they fill you in on what's been happening, and and I think it's not always necessarily in terms of the plans that were created and turn out exactly what we'd imagined at that space. But I even think of having gone through the cyclones, and Wairoa particularly has been hit quite hard. But I think it's the connectivity and the relationships that are built through those collaborative processes that they become such a powerful force of resilience, but those were muscles that were built through those collaborative exercises. And so That's where I see the strength of some of those exercises around whānau order, is the ability to come together to create a collective vision that everybody, you know, sort of buys into. And that process isn't always easy. You know, there's some difficult conversations to be had. It takes some time to get a shared understanding when you sit in different places, but when you sit together for long enough, those bonds, you know, really build. And I think that's held a lot of the whānau down there in good stead, particularly as we've had some adversity, you know, in the last few years. Over in Canada, you know, a different context. Principally, one of the key jobs that we were up there to work on was the establishment of the First Nations Health Authority. And BC was, British Columbia was a real leader in that regard. And so I think, yeah, anything that's new and in that space of innovation is can be quite difficult and challenging and complex in many spaces. I think the communities were having to wrap their heads around, you know, what different and what change was going to look like in their contexts. And so it was a real privilege for us to be kind of holding, you know, and helping to facilitate and hold some of that space of learning for, as we navigated our way through, you know, that quite systemic change for them. Probably more at a personal level. It wasn't so much what the change that happened as a result of any of the projects. It was probably more the change that happened for me. And a lot of that was facilitated in my time in working with the First Nation communities over there. And I think particularly around that, I think the key learning, which is kind of we've brought home with us, is, you know, ko te tikanga matua, ko te aroha. And koina tātou te tangata, te iwi take, he iwi aroha ki te tangata. And so I was always, you know, quite astounded with their level of patience and humility in the way that they would hold space despite many of the complexities and the challenges, and their mana, you know, sort of often being, you know, takahied on by different organisations and systems at play, and yet despite that I always found them to be rich in their depth of culture in terms of their humility and the patience that they were able to hold. To me, they do exemplify people of aroha, you know, and that was probably one of the key learnings for me that I walked away with. And I think Mara's leadership, but also a bit of the Kāhui way, is there's always, you know, humility is a cornerstone component of the way the DNA of Kāhui Tautoko is their exercises. And, you know, it's a space where you're using every day your highest levels of intelligence in multiple, you know, different contexts and disciplines. But humility is the key, you know, to kind of holding the relationships and the connections. And that's why I think the reciprocity of learning is so heightened in that space, is because there's always an exchange kind of going on. It's never one way. Even though we're labelled as consultants or whatever, you know, the way that we turned up into space, you know, under Mara's leadership, and the way of that, you know, it's got her stamp all over it in terms of how she walks through space, you know, and holds different relationships and connections. I think that opens up, and which is, you know, very much an Indigenous, you know, kind of approach to the way that we turn up to the work. And it's never just that we're there to give, we're always, you know, taking something kind of away from those experiences as well. Again, it's a whole whānau experience, it's a whole body experience, it's a whole wairua experience. You know, as I think, unlike probably other spaces where you can't compartmentalise your job, you know, from your family, and those two things shall never meet, you know, something very different at Kāhui Tautoko. And so, my wife is a key part, of the whānau, my kids, so yeah, we were all sort of a part of the package. I think a lot of we're quite privileged in a way of being able to, we got access to lots of different spaces that I think others, that you don't often get, and that comes from a lot of different elements at play, including the relationships that are held, by Kāhui itself, but also at a personal level. There's the type of people that, work at Kāhui Tautoko and hold that same sort of DNA, that open doors, to lots of different opportunities of learning. I think we were given a lot of autonomy and freedom to kind of lead. And I do think of Kāhui Tautoko upon reflection as a real incubator of Māori leadership, under a framework of consultancy, but within that we were able to really kind of go after the projects and the spaces that we were, personally quite invested in and interested in. One for me was I was interested in kind of some of the local government, sort of space, and that was something completely random from anything that Kāhui had done, but was given the freedom and to explore those kinds of spaces, and it still really did fit with the overall kaupapa of what Kāhui Tautoko was about. So I think that's put us in good stead in terms of, sort of post working for Kāhui Tautoko, that 19 years of leadership, sort of spaces meant that now I think that's provided a really strong platform and given lots of good tools that have enabled us to kind of go on and do some pretty special things, which I think when you look at a lot of the Kāhui whānau, and for such a small team, actually they, many of them are kicking in, quite high level sort of leadership spaces, and that's due to them as people and the people that they are, but also a little bit in terms of the space that Kāhui Tautoko has provided to each of us in terms of some of that learning, and probably just building a bit of the confidence to lead in that way. You should. How old will Mara be in 25 years? Hopefully another 25 years to come, and immensely proud to have been part of the fabric, and one of the ones that's helped to weave being part of weaving the story of Kāhui Tautoko. But I think, I think it holds as an exemplar of some bold and courageous leadership. Mara probably doesn't think about herself as an entrepreneur, and a global entrepreneur at that, but she truly kind of is, in terms of having the courage and the conviction of her mahi to kind of take this, beyond our own shores, is I think probably a nakoranga or a lesson that many of us could be kind of taking. But I think to do it in a way where where the entrepreneurship and the model is still to serve, not to sell. And so I think, I think the projects and many of the mahi that make up the story of Kāhui Tautoko really speak into that, into that story. I think that much of it goes back to the name, and the whole whakaaro that Nani Mate had when giving that name was, a group sent out to uplift and support. And I think the true testament of the 25-year legacy is the mahi has held that name, and it's that name therefore holds the kaupapa, as well. And just all of the connections, all of the different spaces, I think the impact has impacted much more in the invisible spaces than the visible things, you know, the projects, and there's a layer of that, but that's about 20% of, you know, Kāhui Tautoko's legacy. It's all the stuff that isn't seen, all of the different connections, all of the leadership that's growing, even these kinds of places, they're all woven into the fabric and have connection, you know, back to Kāhui Tautoko in some way, shape or form. So, you know, and I think that is a little bit of the legacy too, is whilst there's often a rush to kind of look at impact in quite a narrow way and to measure it in quite a narrow way, actually from an Indigenous perspective, the impact of strong kaupapa goes far beyond what we could see or appreciate, because there's always people watching, learning and being inspired by good work kind of going on. And so I'm sure that the Kāhui legacy is much greater than the whānau kind of appreciates. No, we always end up getting sukibaba when we kind of come to all this sort of stuff in terms of how, you know, there's the kaupapa and then there's the deep personal connections of the people actually involved in the Kāhui Tautoko ecosystem, I guess, you know, and that's, yeah, there is such a high level of depth in those relationships with Mara, you know, most importantly, because she's been our leader, you know, in that space, but also with a lot of the other colleagues and kaimahi and their whānau, you know, who are our whānau. And so, you know, it truly is a really whānau oriented space. I think it carries a lot of the DNA of what a Māori business should exemplify, is how we can walk and kick it in two spaces. We can do well at business and yet still very much be plugged into tikanga, mātauranga, you know, ngā taonga kui mā koroma. The two don't have to, you know, be polar opposites. I think there's, I think we need a greater depth of Māori and probably even Indigenous thinkers in a lot of our different spaces, especially into our future spaces. We need more of our highly capable and intelligent people occupying spaces where we're able to lift the depth, the innovation, the creativity of our thinkers in our space, so we can architect really good, high quality, highly effective, you know, spaces for our people. And I think Kāhui Tautoko, you know, in its lessons over the last 25 years gives us a lot of good ideas for where we might start and how we might go about that. And that might not be necessarily what Mara had in mind when she started this journey, but I think as we approach this, you know, really significant milestone, those are probably some of the, you know, the pieces to reflect on and think about, is what does the next 25 years, you know, start to look like? How do we maintain the humility of the way in which we can, you know, things are designed and the way that we turn up into the space? But also, how do we do it so that it doesn't limit us? Because we need to scale things like Kāhui Tautoko to be in many more of our spaces, so that other Indigenous leaders can feel their way into a lot of that different mahi as well. So yeah, I guess that's my way of mahiing to Mara, is she knows how much we love her and respect her, and yeah, but also it's the questions of what comes next and how do we ensure that the legacy of what's been started continues for all of our unborn mokopuna. How do we scaffold and continue to build from what's been done to date? How do we make it even stronger into the future? Yeah.